Introduction. Our response to COVID has surprised, fascinated, and appalled me from the beginning. It seemed obvious to me from the beginning that we were vastly overreacting to this pandemic and doing more harm than good. For a moment in the spring of 2020, I doubted my position, thinking basically, every country in the world is reacting to this with lockdowns. The health departments in almost every country in the world are in favor of lockdowns. What are the odds I am right and practically every other expert in the world is wrong? But it turns out I was right. And it turns out I was not the only expert who thought at the beginning that this was a vast overreaction. It is just that the tech giants and the media did not allow these experts to express their point of view, just as they would have not allow me to. I also knew COVID was not trivial, and that I and everyone was likely to contract it, and that there was a small possibility, maybe 1 in 1,000, that I would die from it at my age. My main fear from that was not that I might die, but that if I did, people would laugh at me and mock me because I had been outspoken in saying we had overreacted to COVID. The heart of this book is an examination of the evidence of, first, how many COVID deaths has the lockdown strategy prevented, and second, how much harm has it done? Mostly not in economic terms, but in human terms, including increasing suicides, drug overdose deaths, and clinical depression. It is shocking to me that the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and our government officials have never estimated or made any claims of how many COVID infections and COVID deaths the lockdown strategy has prevented, let alone any estimate of how much harm lockdowns have done. It is treated as if we had no choice. We had to close schools, issue stay-at-home orders, order mask wearing, close restaurants, close churches, etc. And since we had no choice, supposedly, I guess we were supposed to think it is pointless and heartless towards the elderly and the 550,000 who have died of COVID in the United States to ask whether and to what extent the lockdown strategy worked, i.e., how many COVID deaths did it prevent? Oh well, call me heartless, but I will ask anyway. When you have terminal cancer and your doctor gives you the option to take chemotherapy, I think it is perfectly reasonable to ask whether it would do you any good and how much additional time of life it will get you. In fact, of course, it would be malpractice for your doctor not to give you an estimate of how much time of life chemotherapy would give you, even if you did not ask. In a like manner, we should ask, and our leaders and experts should have also told us, how many COVID deaths would be prevented by the lockdowns, and now that we are a year into this, how many COVID deaths the lockdowns have prevented. Likewise, when you have terminal cancer and your doctor suggests the option of chemotherapy, you should ask, and your doctor should tell you, how unpleasant the chemotherapy will be and what the side effects will be. For the lockdowns, we should ask, and our leaders and experts should have told us, what the harms of the lockdowns would be, and now that we are a year into this, what those harms have been. Our leaders have not answered those questions, so I will. In this book, I ask, can we quantify the harms of lockdowns and compare the harms to the benefits of COVID deaths prevented to determine whether the lockdowns were worth it? Did the lockdowns cause more harm than benefit? Seem like reasonable questions to ask to me. First, I should say that I have bent over backward in this book and in my writings to lean toward overestimating the lethality of COVID and the benefits of our lockdown strategy, and to be conservative in my calculations and leaning towards underestimating the harms of the lockdown strategy. I do not want to leave myself open to criticism that I am exaggerating. I do not need to exaggerate. All the facts and data are on my side. The first part of this book is a human benefit harm analysis, where I estimate how many COVID deaths the lockdowns may be preventing and how that balances against the harms the lockdowns have caused. This analysis is in human terms rather than dollar terms. It is in terms of lost happiness and other harms, and lost and gained time of life from preventing COVID deaths and causing other deaths. Then we analyze the economic harm of the lockdown strategy and how that is borne by the poor, the middle class, and the rich. Part 2 calculates the overall risk of death from COVID-19. The risk of death if you are infected with the virus, the infection fatality rate, the age-specific risk of death from COVID-19, and how that compares to the current risk of death from all causes and risk of death from ordinary influenza. It is shocking and appalling to me that the CDC has never given either an official or even an unofficial estimate of the infection fatality rate of COVID-19. What percentage of infected people die of COVID, and how does that vary by age and health condition? This allows anyone to evaluate their risk and make an informed decision of whether and how to modify their behavior. It is the first question each of us was asking about this, and the CDC should have answered it. Part 3 looks at the evidence of how COVID infection is transmitted and the effectiveness of the interventions we have tried, including mask wearing, closing schools, and hand washing, in reducing transmission. Based on that and the harms of our overall lockdown strategy and of each specific strategy, I recommend what we should have done. Part 4 is miscellaneous observations on various political and public policy issues, including emergency powers of governors, how the courts have treated those emergency powers and the restrictions on our freedom, and how the public has accepted the restrictions, and my surprise at some of that. It looks at how the tech giants and media companies have responded to the lockdowns and their censorship, which I think is not too strong a word, of voices that have criticized the lockdowns. It also looks at who is and is not to blame for the lockdown disaster, and who has behaved well and who has behaved badly. Part 4 also looks at various conspiracy theories, or I should say alternative theories, since they do not necessarily involve a conspiracy, about COVID and the lockdowns and the evidence for and against some of those theories. Part 5 compares the severity of COVID in deaths and lost time of life to other epidemics of the past, including smallpox, the Black Death, AIDS, and the 1918 flu, and to the current leading causes of death of cancer, heart disease, suicide, and drug overdose, and to Vietnam and 9/11. The purpose of that is not to say that COVID-19 was not bad. It was, but to put it in perspective. I found those calculations and comparisons very interesting. Part 5 also compares the lost time of life and human damage caused by lockdowns, not by COVID, but by the lockdowns, to the lost time of life and human damage from the Vietnam War, which many would consider the worst public policy disaster of recent times in the US, at least until the lockdowns. Part 6 has my philosophical musings on what the lockdown response to COVID suggests about humans and our values, particularly our views towards mortality and toward whether time is precious or not. Part 7 is perhaps my favorite part. Our societal response to COVID shows we are willing and able to remake society on a dime and bear enormous sacrifices in response to a crisis. That is the one piece of good news to come out of the lockdowns. It expands the horizon of what is politically feasible enormously. So with the optimism that anything is possible, we can brainstorm what we can and should do to address our most pressing problems, especially environmental problems, that are quite a bit more serious than COVID ever was. And Part 7 asks, if the goal of our public policy were happiness for the greatest number, instead of preventing death for a few more years for elderly sick people, as it seems it was during the lockdowns, or instead of increasing GDP and in particular increasing wealth and income for the richest and most powerful individuals and corporations, as I heretofore thought was the primary goal of the US government, what should we do? In other words, what is the primary goal of life? Happiness, money, or a long life? I choose happiness. If that is the goal, what should our policies be? So you know where I'm coming from. I am a scientist. I have a Ph.D. in biochemistry, and my latest papers have been in immunology. I invented a drug that boosts the immune system to prevent cold sore outbreaks in people with frequent outbreaks, and I started a company around that. So I consider myself an immunologist. I like playing with numbers, and in this project I have found I like playing with numbers and statistics even more than I realized. And I am a Democrat and consider myself a liberal, although a lot of my views are not doctrinaire liberal. It is stated that, quote, we are following the science, end quote, with the lockdown strategy, although, as I will elaborate, that is a big lie. And most Democrats support the lockdown strategy, so you might think I am an outlier in my views. In reality, at least among scientists, I am hardly alone in opposing lockdowns. The Great Barrington Declaration, for instance, is a declaration signed by over 14,000 epidemiologists, immunologists, and other scientists, over 42,000 medical practitioners, and almost 1 million citizens opposing the lockdowns. I have had the feeling during this time of pandemic and lockdowns of being a stranger in my own country. I have been surprised about so many things in this response and have often felt like the little boy in the Emperor Has No Clothes story. The media is saying, and everyone around me seems to believe, that this lockdown response was necessary and beneficial, and the emperor is wearing a beautiful suit as he parades through town. I have been standing there saying, huh? He's buck naked